Welcome to this trip through one of the scariest cases in U.S. history. In the comments, tell me where you're watching right now before we begin. Are any of you close to Missouri's old forests? Because what we're about to say took place right there, among the trees, where no one dares speak the words out loud. 1894. It was getting dark and rainy in the Ozark Mountains in southern Missouri. The leaves turned to shades of brown and dark red, and they covered paths that wound around deep valleys and misty hills. At that time, it wasn't easy to get around that area. Aside from a few dirt tracks that got lost in the old oaks and pines, there were no paved roads. It took miles of thick forest to connect the small towns to each other. It took days to walk to the closest train station, and people who needed to cross those lands had to use carts, horses, and a lot of courage. Webster County was one of those places that time had forgotten. A few people lived there, but they were spread out on farms far away. The economy was based on hunting, woodworking, and small businesses. The plantations. The news didn't get there for weeks. Tourists, or the few newspapers that were available in the area, brought it. The law wasn't strong. Springfield was more than 50 miles away, and the sheriff rarely went on the roads that were farther away. Each man was in charge of himself there. This is the setting for the start of a strange story. Strange stories about sounds coming from deep in the forest were being told by travelers going through the Ozarks. Those sounds were not animal sounds. They were repetitive drums that didn't stop. Sounds of drums beating through the trees at night. Some people said they sounded like old songs from native groups that no longer lived in that area. Some people said it was something else, something that didn't belong in this world. People laughed at first. They thought it was all in the minds of tired travelers, the wind blowing on the hollow logs, or the cheap whiskey sold in bars along the road. But as the weeks went by, more and more stories with the same details came out. Drums in. It was always the same tracks near a deep valley that people in the area have avoided since the first settlers came. The forest called to them. The name of this valley was hard for many people to say. The older people called it the Hollow of Bones, but no one was sure where that name came from. They said there was something wrong with that spot, and that the ground was cursed because animals wouldn't go there. Some people said that hunters' groups had gone missing decades before. But these were just stories. Kids were scared by the stories told around the campfire. At the very least, that's what everyone thought. 6 tourists arrived in the small town of Marshfield in the middle of Webster County in the middle of October of that year. From bigger towns in the east, like St. Louis and Jefferson City, they came to find cheap land to buy and start over. 5 guys and 2 women, all between the ages of 20 and 40, were there. They came with 2 wagons full of goods, tools, clothes, and materials that will last for a few weeks. They were going to cross the Ozarks and go to Arkansas, where they had heard there was good land for sale. They stopped at Marshfield's only pub to rest and get advice on the best way to get there. A man named Josiah Thorne, who owned the business and was 52 years old, gave them venison stew and cornbread while making a rough map on a piece of paper. He showed them the main path, which went along the river and would get them to the border in 3 days. Then one of. They asked about a way to get there faster. And for a moment Josiah did nothing but stare at the whiskey glass in his hand. Afterward he sighed and said that there was in fact a faster way. He didn't suggest going that way because it went right through the mountains and saved almost a whole day of travel. That path hadn't been used in years. It went close to the Hollow of the Bones where the drums were. The tourists were amused. A tall man with a red beard said he wasn't scared of ghost stories. One more said it would be better if they could cross the mountains faster. It was getting warmer. They didn't want to get stuck in the mud when it rained in the winter. Josiah tried to be persistent, but he knew it wouldn't help. Those people looked like they didn't know what the Ozarks could do because they had that innocent faith. The group left early the next morning. From the porch of the bar, Josiah watched them go through the trees and out of sight. They would never be seen living again. What we learned later told us that the first 2 days of the trip were pretty quiet. The path went along a narrow ridge with views of misty fields below. It was dry and cold outside. They set up camp in clearings at night, built big fires, and talked about their plans for the next day. Everything looked fine. It looked like everything was okay. Things changed on the third night. At a point where the trail started to go down into the valley, they set up camp next to a stream. The sun went down quickly, as it. At that time of year, it always did, and in just a few minutes, the forest went dark. The crackling of the fire made the trees around it dance with shadows. After that, they heard the drums. At first, the sound was very low and hard to hear. It sounded like a heartbeat coming from deep in the bush. One of the guys put up his hand to ask everyone to be quiet. No one said anything else. The only sound besides the steady beats resonating between the trees was the crackle of the fire. There was no tune. There was no change, just. That steady beat made me feel like a huge creature was breathing in the woods. One of the women suggested that they leave right away, put out the fire, get the carts, and walk back along the road, even though it was dark. But the others were not sure. The night was over. The trails were dangerous, and pulling heavy wagons at night could cause a major accident. Also, one of the men said, those were just sounds like a native group performing a ceremony, or quiet storms hitting the area. Caves. There was no reason to be scared. The sound changed after that. It seemed like the beats were getting closer as they got faster and stronger. They didn't come from a certain place. Around the camp, they seemed to come from everywhere at once. Voices were the next thing that made my blood run cold. They were words that I didn't know. They weren't yells. People had never heard anything like those whispers before. They sounded like dozens of mouths talking at once in a language no one had ever heard. The man with the red beard reached for his gun. While someone else lit a torch and moved to the edge of the clearing, they could not see anything because it was so dark. It was so thick in the forest that the flashlight's light could only reach a few meters deep. The drums kept beating in their chests, making the ground slightly shake under their feet. That's when they saw the first people. Tall shadows standing still in the trees like statues. They didn't move. They did not. There is no sound but that low, steady chant. They did nothing but watch. The man with the flashlight yelled out, "Who are you?" and demanded that they show their ID. Not an answer. The figures stayed where they were, like shadows that had hardened. One of the women started to pray out loud. The other one was holding on to one of the men's arms and crying quietly. There was a lot of waiting going on around the campfire, with rifles pointing into the darkness. They didn't know what to call it. Then, just as quickly as it started, then stopped. The drums stopped beating. The sounds are gone. The forest was filled with a heavy blanket of silence. The people in the trees were no longer there. They might not have been at all, though. It was cold at night, and the wind was blowing through the trees. That night, no one slept. They kept the fire going all night and watched every shadow and movement on the edge of light until dawn. They couldn't believe they had made it through until the sun finally came up, shining through the fog. But now something was different. There was something in the air about the way the trees looked at them. They needed to return. In that moment, they should have left the wagons behind and run back to Marshfield. They didn't, though. It could have been pride. Maybe they didn't want to look like fools. Maybe it was just human stubbornness that wouldn't let go of the unknown. They chose to move on. After all, they were almost on the other side of the mountain range. They would be safe in 1 or 2 more days. They began going down toward the valley. The path became less wide, and it got steeper and wound around mossy rocks and twisting roots that looked like claws sticking out of the ground. The trees' closed cover made it hard for the sun to get through. It felt like going into a green, damp, hot cave. They found the first mark at noon. That big oak tree next to the path had a sign carved into its trunk. It wasn't a letter. Nothing that any of them knew was there. It looked like a rough circle with lines that looked like fingers or roots going around it. The wood. It was dark around the carving, like it had been dyed by sap or very old blood. After some time, they found another mark. The next one was always on the tree trunks next to the path, with the same symbol. It looked like they were being led or warned. One of the guys said it might have been the marks of old hunters showing where their territory was. But those signs didn't seem human in some way. They looked like they were looking at something that shouldn't be there because of how they were carved and how uneven the depths of the cuts were. As the afternoon went on, they reached the center of the Hollow of Bones. The valley opened up in front of them. It was a deep depression between two high hills, and a thick fog covered it. The fog wouldn't go away, not even when the sun was out. In the middle of the valley there were black, twisting trees with no leaves or life. There were a lot of rotted leaves on the ground, and they smelled sweet and bad. There were also a lot of bones lying around among the dead trees, half hidden in the dark, whitish mud. Over time, animal bones from deer, bears, and other animals that no one could name. And in the middle of it all, a building that was partly hidden by the bushes. It wasn't a natural building. The stones were stacked in an uneven circle that was about 10 meters across. Inside the circle, the ground was made of beaten dirt that was as hard as stone and had no plants at all. The tourists stopped to look at that view at the edge of the valley. They didn't want to go down, but the path went straight through a circle of rocks. There was no other way to do it. They were running out of food and water, and going around the valley would have added days to their trip. The man with the red beard made the choice. Before it got dark, they would quickly go down, cross the circle, and go up the other side of the hill. Easy and quick. There's no place to camp in the valley, so just go on by. They began to go down. The soft ground made the cart wheels sink. The horses didn't want to pull, and it was hard for them to do so. There was fog. It was thicker than it looked from above, and a grayish-white veil blocked all but a few meters of the view. There was no sound at all. There were no birds, bugs, or small animals moving around in the grass. There was only the sound of the wheels rattling and the heavy breathing of the horses. At the time they got to the stone circle, the sun was already going down. Light that came through the mist at an angle cast long, wavy shadows. One of the men said they should set up camp there. Inside the circle, and said that at least the ground was solid, but the others quickly turned down the idea. This place was very badly broken, something that made my skin crawl and my stomach turn. The drums then began to play again. This time, the sound was different. The sound didn't come from the nearby bush. It seemed to be coming from below, from inside the earth. It was like a huge object was hitting the ground and making it shake. The stones in the circle moved a little, making a high-pitched tinkle that mixed with the drum's deep beat. The horses got scared and snarled and pulled the rez tight. As the wheels went through the mud, one of the wagons almost fell over. The numbers then showed up again. Now, though, it wasn't just shadows in the trees far away. They got much closer and formed a circle around the group. They were tall and hard to see because of the fog, but they looked like people. Some of them looked like they were bent at weird angles. Others stayed as well, straight, as hard as poles. Even though none of them moved, it was very clear that someone was watching them. The man with the red beard fired his gun into the air, hoping the loud sound would scare whatever was there. The shot could be heard all the way through the valley and up and down the hills. The drums stopped for a short time. After the sound, there was nothing but quiet, which was worse. It felt like there was nothing there, and it made my heart beat faster for no reason. Then the images started to move very slowly. They didn't walk. Slipped. They walked up to the circle of stones without moving their legs or making any noise like footsteps. They just moved through the mist like ink on water. And as the visitors got closer, they could see more details that would have made any sane person go crazy. They weren't people. They were nothing that a person ever was. The sizes were not right. The arms and legs were too long. The faces were just dark spots that didn't have any clear features. And they looked vegetal, as if. They were made of tree bark and roots that were twisted together. They had a thin, clear skin on top. Some of them had branches coming out of their necks. Some of them looked like dark sap that was dripping and staining the ground they walked on. One of the women passed out. The other man grabbed her and yelled for everyone to get on the wagons right away. There was no longer any talk. There were no more questions. They had to leave that place. They had to leave that scary place right away, before it was too late. The horses were beaten very hard. The wagons shook strongly as they went over the circle of stones, and the group ran quickly to the other side of the valley. The creatures wouldn't let them go, though. Once they started to chase them, they got faster and closer, but they didn't run. Instead, they slid through the mist. The drums started up again, this time louder and faster, with those voices overlapping this time. That song with the dead tones made my blood run cold. One of them made it to the back of the wagon. He put out what looked like an arm. The moment he touched the wood, the whole car shook like it had been hit by lightning. Right in front of their eyes, the wood started to rot. It turned dark, cracked, and broke into pieces that fell like ashes. The driver of that cart jumped to the ground, dropped everything, and ran after the other cart that was already going up the hill. They turned around and left. They were unable to. Any pause, even a split second, would cause those things to catch up with them. They stumbled up the hill, leaving behind half of the food, tools, clothes, and anything else that would have slowed them down. It was only important to get away. Getting away from that damned valley was all that mattered. It was already dark when they finally got to the top of the hill. Even though it was completely dark, they kept moving forward, following the narrow road they could just barely see. Behind them, they could still hear the drums. Far away, but still there, as if the whole forest had turned into a bad place of music. That night, no one knows how far they walked. Definitely hours, or even the whole night. They could no longer hear the drums when they finally stopped. Instead of being in the valley, they were in a different opening in the forest that seemed normal and even friendly. They were too tired to think or start a fire, so they fell to the ground. They saw that there were only 5 of them left when the sun came up. One of the men was not with them anymore. No one could. They need to remember the last time they saw him. He had just vanished in the chaos of the escape and the darkness. They yelled his name and looked all over the area, but he wasn't there. No one was brave enough to turn around and go back the way they came. They chose to keep going, but this time they went faster because they were so eager to get out of those mountains. The cart that was still there was broken. It could still move even though one of the wheels was broken. They walked along the path all day without stopping to rest or do anything else. While they were walking, they talked and hoped that every corner would show signs of society, but the forest seemed to go on forever. The trees grew up around the path and made live walls. The branches that were tangled together hid the sun, and they still had the feeling that someone was following them. They only heard and saw themselves walking, but the feeling was there all the time and was very strong. They found the second victim, or rather what was left of them, in the late afternoon of it. One of the men took a short break from the path to get water from a stream nearby. He came back yelling, and his face was as white as paper. It was the lost man's clothes that he had found. They were torn, dirty, and spread out among the tree roots that had fallen, but there was no body. There were only the clothes and marks on the trees around them. It was the same jagged swirls they had seen before, but this time they were brand new and the sap was still running out of the trees. The clothes were not touched. They went back to the trail in silence and kept walking. There were no more tears. No longer was there any real fear. Instead, there was a cold numbness, an awful understanding that they might not make it out of that place alive. When night fell again, they had no choice but to stop. On those dangerous trails, they couldn't go on in the dark. A small fire was lit, and they crowded around it with their rifles on their knees. The two women were shocked and just stared into space. The last two guys took turns. While they watched, they both knew that there would be no way to defend themselves if those animals came back. That night, the drums didn't show up, but something worse did. The woman who had passed out in the valley started to talk to herself. He mumbled words that they couldn't understand in the same dead language they had heard in the animal songs. They had their eyes open, but they couldn't see anything. The red-beard man was looking past the flames, past the trees, and past the world of the living. They shook her shoulders and called her name over and over, but she didn't answer. He said those strange words over and over again, louder and louder, until his voice turned into a high-pitched cry that shook the forest. Then she stopped all of a sudden. She fell forward, passed out, and her breathing became shaky. They put her down by the fire and used the few blankets they still had to cover her. It was cold on his skin, even though the flames were very hot. A weak and irregular pulse was felt. When the other lady tried to comfort her, she wet her forehead with water from the canteen and whispered words that didn't sound real in that quiet place. No one slept any longer. They looked out into the forest and waited for the shadows to show up again in the trees. But the night was still very quiet. The only sounds were the cold wind blowing between the bare trees and the campfire sometimes crackling. There was an odd stillness in the air, like the forest was holding its breath, watching and waiting. When dawn finally came, the woman who had screamed did not wake up when the light came through the morning fog. Without making a sound, he stopped breathing some time before sunrise. He stood still with his eyes wide open and fixed on the sky above the trees. It wasn't possible to see any marks. There were no signs of fighting. It felt like someone had ripped his soul out in the middle of the night. They didn't have the right tools to dig a proper hole. They put twigs and leaves over the body, said a quick prayer, and moved on. 4 people were now walking through a forest that never seemed to stop. They were all hurt and broken. The path went back up and wound its way down a rocky slope with few trees. It felt good to leave the forest's closed-off shade and feel the weak sun on my face. The horizon was also nice to see. From that high point they could see farther away mountains that were hidden by the constant fog that was typical of the Ozarks. Arkansas was somewhere past those faraway hills. There was a civilized world. There was safety, but there was still a long way to go. The wagon finally gave way. As it went over a big rock, the cracked wheel broke in half and the car flipped over on its side with a bang. The few things they still had with them were spread out along the path. When the horses were finally free of their load, they ran off down the road before anyone could catch them. They were now really by themselves. They had to take everything on their backs and didn't have any animals or ways to get around. The man with a red beard gave them what they could take. Have some dry food, water canteens, blankets, and rifle ammo on hand. They left everything behind right then, even the hopes for a new life that had led them to that green hell in the first place. They kept going on foot. It hurt to walk slowly. They were weak because they hadn't eaten enough and hadn't slept enough. They kept going even though his boots were worn out and blisters were on his feet. It meant to die to stop. That's now clear. The forest didn't like weak people. By late afternoon, they had got to a place that looked like it had been there before. A stream, a clearing, or a certain layout of rocks covered in moss. The man without a beard suddenly stopped and said that they had been there before, maybe yesterday or the day before. They kept going around and around. The man with the red beard denied it. It was not possible. The trail led them all the way, and they never turned around or went back. They looked around more and thought they knew this place. Then they saw writing on a nearby tree that said, one of those signs was half hidden by a plant. The wavy spiral circled by lines that looked like fingers. It wasn't old. The cut wood was still clear from being out in the open. He was following a road that was marked by someone or something, which kept them in the forest. The group was hit with this truth like a wave of ice water. They had never been in charge. From the moment they walked into the pit of bones, or maybe even before that, when they heard the drums for the first time that night, they were pushed like cattle toward. They couldn't figure out where it was. The other woman finally gave up. She had been strong up until that point. He got down on his knees in the mud and started to cry so hard that his whole body shook. She asked them to stop, give up, and just stay there until the end. There was no way out. There was no way out. They were stuck in the forest and couldn't get out. The man with the red beard lifted it hard, almost harshly. He told them that they would not die there and would fight until the end. Take a deep breath. But his voice was shaking. The sadness in his eyes was the same as everyone else's. They moved anyway. They didn't follow the marked path and went straight through the dense forest instead. They hoped that by breaking the pattern, they could get out of the invisible maze that had trapped them. There was a lot of greenery, which scratched their faces and tore their clothes. There were thorns all over the skin. Every step they took made them trip because the roots were so unstable. But they kept going, moving forward without looking back. Primal forest, far from the path, from reason, and from any sense of direction. That's when the fog came back down. They knew right away that it wasn't normal fog. That sweet smell of death that they had smelled in the valley was in it. It was too thick and white. It quickly covered everything and made it impossible to see more than 1 meter away. They held on to each other so they wouldn't get split. They moved slowly, feeling their way through the trees that they couldn't see. Then they heard steps, but they weren't the slipping steps of things, people, or just normal tracks on the forest floor, coming from somewhere in the fog. Someone called. They had lost the man the first night when they tried to leave the valley, and that was his voice they heard. The man with the red beard yelled back, calling out the name of his lost friend. Now the voice was closer and said that he was hurt and needed help. It also said that he could see a way out of the forest right ahead. He told them to quickly follow him. There was something wrong with the tone. The other woman saw it first. He grabbed the man with the red beard by the arm and whispered in his ear that they should not follow that voice because it wasn't really his friend and was just a trick. But the other man had already started walking toward the sound and calling out that he was on his way. He tried to hold him down, but the man with the red beard pulled him away quickly and he disappeared in the thick fog. They could hear him walking farther away. Then there was a terrible pause, and then they heard a scream. That sound wasn't a scream of pain. It was even worse. The sound came from someone seeing something that no one should ever see. Something that broke reason into pieces that can't be fixed. For a long time, the scream cut through the air. Then there was hysterical laughter, tears, and then complete quiet. Not a sound, not a breath, nothing. Just the white cloud that covered everything and couldn't be seen through. The man with the red beard and the woman were stuck and holding on to each other, almost afraid to breathe. We waited for minutes that felt like hours. The mist didn't go away, and there was complete quiet. He finally told them in a whisper that they had to move because staying still would kill them. She gave a quiet nod. They tried to walk again, but this time they were very careful and tested each step before putting weight on it. They moved through that white, dead world like ghosts. They were lost for what to do next. They had no more plans. They left the area where they heard the scream and hoped that, by getting farther away from that place, they were able to get out of it. The mist slowly lifted, showing first the dark shapes of the trees, then the leafy ground, and finally the gray sky through the trees. They were now in a different part of the forest, where the trees were even older and their stems were twisted into strange shapes that didn't make sense. Some of them had dark spots that looked like mouths that were open. Some had roots that stuck out of the ground like limbs that were frozen. And there were more signs than just on the tree branches. They were on the rocks, the ground, and even the leaves that had fallen. Something or someone had recently gone by and left a mark on everything. It looked like the whole area was being taken back and changed into something that didn't fit in nature anymore. As they walked through those scary trees, their nerves were on edge. Every shadow seemed to move, and every sound scared them to death. It was getting late in the afternoon, and soon it would be night. It's the third night in that hell. They were sure they couldn't last another night out in the open without a fire or a safe place to stay. That's when the hut was found. It seemed to come out of nowhere in the trees. A small wooden structure covered in moss and vines that was almost completely taken over by the trees. The door was only half open, and the wind was making it squeak a little. There were no signs of life. The chimney wasn't giving off smoke, but it was a safe place to be. It was a place to hide from the getting closer night. The man with the red beard slowly walked up, gun in hand, and pushed the door open with his foot. The hinge squeaked, and the door opened all the way, letting the dark inside out. There were cracks in the walls and holes in the roof that let in some weak light. There were leaves and other things on the ground. There was simple furniture like a table lying on its side, a broken chair, and empty shelves on the wall. There were also clean, white human bones stacked in a corner. Skulls, ribs, and femurs are among the bones that are carefully stacked in a macabre pile. That evil shape was next to the pile cut into the wooden floor. It was big enough for a person to lie down on inside. The woman jumped back and put her hand over her mouth to keep from screaming. Still, the man with the red beard came in and looked around in every corner and shade. There was nothing else. The cabin had been empty for a very long time, maybe even decades. That person who lived there and left those bones is no longer alive. But it was a place to stay, and night was. To fall. They had no choice. So they wouldn't touch the bones directly. They used branches to pull them out and threw everything into the bush. They put leaves and dirt over the sign that was on the ground. A small fire was started in the middle of the hut with dry wood that they found stacked in a corner. The door was closed as best they could. They shared the last piece of dried meat they had and drank water from canteens that were almost empty. They did not talk. There was not anything else to say. It was like they were lost in thought, too heavy to speak. They just stared at the fire. Through the holes in the walls, night came in. They could see that the forest was completely dark. Then, as expected, the drums started. They were far away at first, but they got closer over time, this time with footsteps. The man with the red beard took many steps and drew circles around the cabin very slowly and carefully. He then loaded his gun and sat down near the door. The woman pulled out a knife from her belt. The blade was shaking so hard that it mirrored the fire's light in a mess of patterns. As they waited, they heard the footsteps going back and forth. This went on for hours. The fire was getting smaller, but no one was brave enough to move to add more wood. Then someone outside spoke. That voice wasn't that of the lost soldier. They had never heard that voice before. There was a lot of duplication, like dozens of people talking at once, but they all said the same thing. He spoke English well, easy to learn English. It said that they had been picked, that the forest had called them, and that the drums had led them. It also said that they now belonged there, that their bodies would feed the ground, that their bones would join other bones, and that their voices would add to the choir of all time. That fighting back was pointless, that giving up was peace, and that the end was just the start. This time, the man with the red beard yelled back that they would not give up and would fight until the very end. He shot his gun through a crack in the wall, making a loud noise that filled the small room. The voice laughed. That laugh wasn't from a person. Broken twigs, wind blowing through hollow bones, and earth falling over long-forgotten tombs were the sounds. There were no more steps. The drums stopped playing, and then something pushed the door open. The old wood groaned slowly as it was pushed against something that couldn't be moved. The man with the red beard slammed the door shut, but whatever was on the other side was too strong for him. Strong. The door slowly began to open. The woman desperately looked around for another way out. In the back wall, there was a small window that was partly blocked by boards. She ran over, ripped the planks off with all the force of shock, and squeezed through the small space. He hit the other side hard, rolled around on the wet ground, and then started running. She ran without stopping to look back or think. She didn't even pick a path. He left the cabin without saying a word. He got away from those voices from beyond this world. The dead person whose breath he could feel on his neck made him move away. The forest was a mess of dark spots and sharp twigs that hurt her skin, but she didn't feel any pain. Everything had gone dull for her because of fear, which had turned her into pure adrenaline and survival instinct. She heard a loud bang behind her as the cabin door finally opened. He heard the guy with the red beard scream, at first a defiant cry that quickly changed into something more disturbing. Then there was silence, which was worse than any sound because it meant she was dead. Now, really, by myself. He tripped over a root and hit the muddy ground hard. He stood there for a moment, taking desperate gulps of air because his heart was beating so fast it felt like it would burst. He had tears on his face, along with the mud. I was ready to give up. It made me want to close my eyes and end everything. In spite of this, she couldn't help but stand up and keep going. She slowly got to her feet and kept talking, but this time she tried to be quiet. The moon was up, but it was dim and far away. It broke through the clouds and lit up the trees in a ghostly way. She could see well enough not to hit any trees, but not well enough to be sure that nothing was following her in the dark spaces between the trees. It looked like he walked for hours. He never got used to the forest because it was always changing and hiding new scary things in every clearing, valley, and mountain. He saw trees dripping red sap, mushrooms with circles that seemed to glow dimly in the dark, and rocks piled up in ways that couldn't be natural. There were drums that were too loud to hear. They never really stopped. The rhythmic beats reminded her that the forest was alive, that it was being watched, and that no matter how fast it ran, it would never really get away. She kept going until she reached a stream. She hoped that the water would take her out of the mountains. The current was fast and foamy over rocks that were easy to slip on. She fell a lot and got soaked to the bone in the cold water, but she kept going. It was a real stream. It was. Of course, after the world had lost all sense, it made sense to do that. The first light came on at that time. It wasn't the sun. It looked like firelight dancing in the trees in front of me. A thin, pale cloud of smoke rose. He felt hopeful for a moment. It could have been a farm. It could have been tourists. There may have been real people who could help her. She slowly got closer, going from tree to try to see without being seen. An open fire in a small area gave off light. All around her, there were forms. First, he thought they were people sitting, but then he saw the awful truth. They were the bodies of his friends. It looked like they were having a friendly chat because they were sitting in a circle around the fire. They were dead, though. That was clear even from a distance. Their bodies were too stiff, their angles were off, and their heads were bent in ways that no living neck could support. And something was getting bigger inside them. There were roots and shoots coming out of their mouths, eyes, and their hands wide open. They were becoming a part of the forest by being swallowed by it. The man with the red beard, the two others who had been lost, and even the woman who had died in her sleep were all there, slowly being eaten by the plants around them in a bizarre parody of friendship. She took a step back and put her hand over her mouth to keep from screaming in shock. He couldn't look or turn away. At that point, he saw that there was an empty. There is room in the circle, a place that is ready for her, with leaves set up like seats and twigs arranged in a certain way. He turned around and ran again. All attempts to be quiet were given up. It didn't matter if they made noise. It didn't matter if they heard it. They already knew where it was. From the start, they always knew. The forest as a whole was made up of those animals. Each tree is an eye that watches, and each root is a finger that is ready to grab. Then she broke through the bushes and climbed. She went down steep hills on her hands and knees and through valleys where the fog swallowed her whole. His legs were shaking from being so tired. His lungs hurt. Sadly, he couldn't stop. When you stopped, you joined that circle. It meant becoming another plant statue that would wait in that cursed area forever. Things started to change again in the forest. The trees were getting farther apart, and the weeds were getting less thick. More light was getting through the foliage, and you could see more sky above. He then saw something amazing and unbelievable. He hadn't seen that in days. There was a real road with wagon tracks in the dirt, made by wheels and horses that led away from that green nightmare. He fell to his knees in the middle of the road as he stumbled to it. He was crying with happiness. He had gotten away. Even though it seemed impossible and against the forest's will, he got out. The woods that he had come out of were still there when he looked back. It wasn't just trees. They were guardians and sentinels of old. Secrets, and were silent spectators to horrible things that happened generation after generation. They didn't go after her, though. There was silence at the edge of the forest. It was like there was an imaginary line between them and the forest that they either couldn't cross or didn't want to. The drums were no longer playing. The quiet that followed was different. It wasn't scary anymore. It was just empty and sad, like the forest was missing a prey that got away. She stood up, but she was shaking, and started to walk along the road. He had no idea where he was going. It didn't bother him. It was better anywhere else. During the hours he walked, he stumbled a few times but always moved forward and away. Dawn saw that she was still going. The sun has never looked so lovely, real, and living. As soon as it got light, the sounds of the forest began. Birds singing, squirrels running through the trees, and the wind rustling through the leaves in ways that didn't imply any danger. After that, he saw real smoke coming from real chimneys. In the distance, he saw buildings, a small town with wooden houses, a church with a white tower, houses, and real people walking between them all show that there is life, safety, and society. When she got to the town, she was barely able to believe it was real. The first people who saw her backed away in fear. Her clothes were torn and dirty, her hair was tangled with sticks and leaves, and her face was scratched and stained with dried blood. She must have looked like a ghost. He looked like he saw things that shouldn't have been there because his eyes were blank. An old man carefully walked up. He was asked if he needed help. She tried to talk, but she couldn't find the words. She was screaming so much that her throat was too dry and hurt. He just looked back at the line of mountains in the Ozarks and fell down. The room where he woke up was clean and smelled like soap and medicine. He had a fever, and an older woman was sitting to the side, holding his hand and putting cold packs on his temples. It took days for her to loosen up, her fever to go down, and her body to start to feel better. He would get better from the bodily injuries, but his mind would never be the same. When she finally got to telling her story, she did it in bits and pieces that the woman who was taking care of her had to put together like a maze. What did he talk about? The drums, the strange creatures, the valley of bones, the hut with its evil altar, and the circle of the dead waiting for him to arrive. The woman listened in silence, and as she did, her face got paler and paler. After the survivor was through, the woman slowly nodded and said something that made her cold, even though she was in a warm, sunny room. She told me that she wasn't the first person to go missing in those mountains. Every few years, travelers would go missing in those mountains, and some would come back broken and crazy, talking about drums, voices, and things that grew where they shouldn't have. Other travelers would never come back, leaving behind only empty wagons and supplies scattered along the forgotten trails. The village she had reached was called Seymour, and it was a small town at the southern end of Webster County. People who lived in the Ozarks knew stories that had been told there for generations. They were aware of the odd spots in the forest where animals wouldn't go, and even the most skilled hunts would get lost for no reason. In the church's small library, there were old notes of events like this that had happened since the first settlers. In 1832, a whole family went missing. In 1857, a group of miners went on a trip and never came back. 2 brothers were found lost and blind in 1871, and dumb, something that had broken their minds in a way they could never explain. And the same things happened every time: the drums at night, the trails that went in loops, the strange marks on the trees, and the feeling of being led like cattle to a terrible end. The old people said the forest was hungry. He picked his victims based on a thing that no one could understand because he had to eat. Sheriff of Seymour, William Hackett, 48, set up a search party 2 weeks after she disappeared. Arrived. She got together 12 armed men who had all been to the mountains before and followed the vague instructions she could give them. They looked in the hut, the valley of bones, and the group of dead people around the campfire. There was nothing there for them. The trails she talked about were not in the right place. Some of the guys swore they knew every valley in that area, but the valley could not be found. There was no such thing as the hut with the bones, or it could not be found. It was like the geography of the mountains had moved around to hide their secrets. They did find something, though. They found the fragments of a wagon in a clearing deep in the forest. There were irons that could still be seen, even though the wood was rotting and covered in moss. And there were bones all over the place, some of them half buried in the ground. There was room for more than 6 people to leave. Over decades, or even centuries, many people were killed and buried in the same spot. Around the clearing, that sign was carved into every tree. An uneven circle with lines that looked like fingers or roots going around it. They were old. The bark on some of them had already healed. Others were new, and the wood that was showing was still clean and fresh. The sheriff told them how to properly bury the bodies and to make that area off-limits. Those trails shouldn't be used. That depth is not for anyone to go, but he and everyone else knew that no one would listen to the warning. People always didn't believe the stories and thought they were beliefs of simple people who relied on their own strength and smarts to stay alive when others failed. The forest would be ready for them. Records at the time show that the survivor's name was 26-year-old Sarah Whitmore, and she never fully recovered. He stayed in Seymour for the rest of his life and wouldn't go more than a few hundred yards outside of the town. Most nights, he woke up yelling and said he heard the drums again and saw people standing in the trees outside his house. Window, that he could feel roots going down into his epidermis. After a few years, she married a farmer in the area. He was nice and never asked her about what had happened in the woods. They had 3 kids and a simple, quiet life. But she never smiled. Not really. Behind his eyes, something was broken that could not be fixed by being normal. In 1917, when she was 49 years old, she died of what doctors called heart failure. But people who knew her knew what was really going on. His heart had stopped because it was heavy. That no heart was meant to carry. The weight of having seen through the veil and touched something ancient and evil that lived in the trees and waited calmly for its next meal. His grave is still there in the small cemetery of Seymour. It is marked by a simple stone that only has his name and the times he was born and died on it. People in the area try not to get too close to it at dusk, though. People say that when the wind blows from the mountains in a certain direction, you can sometimes hear a low rhythmic sound. Sound like drums far away or a heartbeat coming from the ground. What if you're stupid enough to follow that sound and let it lead you to the old trails that run through the Ozarks? You might find that the forest is still hungry, that the trees still have carvings of symbols, and that the circle of the dead is still waiting for more people. In the years after Sarah Whitmore moved to Seymour, there were no solutions, only more questions. The Webster County News is the neighborhood paper. Citizen wrote several pieces about missing people in the Ozarks during the year 1895. Once editor Thomas Bridger, 34 years old, talked to Sarah for the first time about the case. He became obsessed with it. Bridger went to Springfield and then Jefferson City to look through old court and county records. He found patterns that were scary. There were waves of disappearances. There was a peak every 7 or 8 years. Travelers went missing without a sign, or only pieces of their belongings turned up later, spread out along the trails. Between these peaks, there were times when things were pretty quiet. The forest seemed to sleep. The paths were safe, and the drums stopped playing. History showed that the next best year would be around 192 or 193. The best year before that was 1894. During those years, Bridger put out warnings in his newspaper asking people to stay away from certain trails. People in the bigger towns didn't believe what he said, though. People called him an attention-getting author, someone who studied country beliefs, and someone who made up stories. News stories that make money. He wasn't making things up. 8 years after what happened with Sarah's group, in March 1922, another group of tourists went missing. This time, there were 5 of them, 3 men and 2 women from Kansas City going south to find work on Arkansas's new cotton farms. They left Marshfield and went in the same direction that Sarah and her friends had gone. The mountain range kept them from getting to the other side. A group of searchers found. Their carts were left in a clearing, and the horses were already dead and decaying, but they were still connected to their harnesses. The guns were loaded and lying on the ground, as if they had been dropped in a hurry. The supplies were still there, but there were no dead bodies. There was no blood. There were no signs of a fight. All that was left were the fresh, dripping sap marks on all the trees nearby, and someone had used white stones to make a big circle on the rough ground of the open. There were tracks inside the circle, a lot of tracks going around, over and over in the same pattern, as if people were marching or dancing in a line. At the middle of the circle, where the ground had been turned over, the footprints stopped all of a sudden. It looked like something had been buried, or, even scarier, something had come out from under the ground. Thomas Bridger was part of the search party. He carefully wrote down what he saw, drew the symbols, and got samples of the white stones. When he got back to Seymour, he spent days locked in his office going over everything he had found with history books, local legends, and any other piece of knowledge that might help make sense of this madness are welcome. What he found scared him to death. The images were picked at random. They were a way to write, or at least talk to each other. He wasn't able to fully translate them, but he could see trends. Some symbols always showed up near bodies of water, others always on hillsides, and still others always in deep valleys. It looked like they were marking their territory by splitting the forest into areas that were used for different things. And, when the bones were ground up and then pressed back into rigid shapes, they looked like white stones. Someone or something was putting markers on the graves of people who had died before, turning death into building and horror into art. Bridger wrote about what he found in a special issue of the Webster County Citizen in June 1922. The press made a big fuss. There were copies sent to New York, Chicago, and St. Louis. People outside of the Ozarks started to pay attention to what was going on for the first time. But the attention led to things that were not expected. The stories didn't turn people away. Instead, they brought in a new kind of guest. People who like to solve mysteries, study the occult, and go on adventures to show their mettle. As soon as they got to Seymour, they hired local guides who were willing to risk their lives for money to show them the way to the forbidden places. Most of them came back empty-handed because they got lost on the trails or were slowed down by sudden rains. Some came back quiet, upset, and mute, unwilling to talk about what they had seen, and some of them never came back. In August of that year, Dr. Edmund Faulkner, a 51-year-old anthropology professor at the University of Missouri, came to Seymour with two of his students. After reading Bridges's work, he was sure that the symbols were proof of an unknown native society that may have lived in the area before the Oj tribes did. Faulkner was careful and doubtful. He didn't believe in ghost stories or weird animals from other worlds. He believed in facts, proof, and logical reasons for things. Native American art made the images. The people who went missing were likely killed by wild animals, natural disasters, or a mentally ill person living alone in the woods. There are ways to explain everything if enough information is gathered. Sarah Whitmore begged him not to go. He had a strong grip on her hands and looked deeply into his eyes to try to convince him that it wasn't just a myth. The person wasn't crazy. It wasn't just a thought. It was true. There was a forest there. Those things were real. They were ready to go. Rather than being upset, he thanked her nicely and left. Faulkner's expedition brought scientific tools, cameras, measuring tools, and notebooks for keeping thorough records. They were going to spend 2 weeks making maps of the areas with the most symbols, taking samples, and taking pictures of the places. They set out from Seymour on a clear late summer morning with a local guide who knew the main paths. 3 days later, the guide came back by himself, running, tripping, and almost not making sense. Fright. They found something, he said. It wasn't a native village or an archaeological site. It was something living that shouldn't be there. Faulkner pushed on writing things down, getting closer and gathering proof. The trees began to move after the kids followed him. It wasn't the wind. The trees moved, with their roots breaking off the ground and placing themselves meters in front of the group to form a wall. There were twigs that stuck out like arms. The bark had mouth-like openings, and sounds could be heard, so. Huge groups of people talking in tongues that hurt my ears just to hear them. The guide ran away. He went right away. He didn't try to help other people. He ran like he had never run before. He heard screams coming from behind him, yells that were suddenly muffled, as if they were being choked by something thick and alive. He turned around and left. Not until he was out of the woods and back in Seymour, where things were safer, did he stop. There was another search trip planned. This time, 20 armed men, Hackett the sheriff, and Bridger Thomas. It was easy for them to find Faulkner's camp. The tents were still set up, and the gear was spread out but still there. The cameras were there, but the film hadn't been developed yet. But Faulkner and his kids were no longer there. And all around the camp, those cursed symbols were cut so deeply into the trees that the sap was still flowing. There were hundreds of them, covering every inch of bark. The forest looked like a horrifying book written in a language of nightmares. Thomas Bridger took the cameras back to Seymour, who developed the pictures in his own room, which was kept dark. He really thought about setting everything on fire and never talking about it again after seeing the pictures. The reporter won, though. People around the world had to know, even if it made them crazy. The first pictures showed normal scenes from the expedition. The camp being set up, the students happy next to the tents, and Fulner posing next to a tree with symbols on it. But then the picture. Things began to strange. One of them, which was taken at dusk, had people in the background that no one had seen when it was shot. Tall, jagged figures can be seen in the woods far away, watching the camp. Fulner's notes show that the people were closer in the next picture, which was taken a few minutes later, and even closer the next time. The last picture that was produced showed the camp at night from inside. A long exposure time was set on the camera so that it could see details in the dark. What he caught was a lot. More than just facts. The 3 people sleeping in their tents could be seen through the thin cloth because the flashlight inside was shining on them. And around the tents there were circles and circles of figures, maybe dozens or even hundreds of them leaning forward to watch the weak people who were waiting. The most unsettling thing, though, was the one that showed up in part in the bottom corner of the picture. Something big that looked like it was made of tangled roots and branches that came together to form a shape that looked a bit like a person, but on an impossible level. At least 4 meters tall, and maybe even more. And there was a dark, deep hole where his head should have been. Hundreds of thin twigs stuck out of the hole. Bridger only put 2 of the least disturbing pictures in his newspaper, along with a story about how Fulner went missing. Other ones he kept in a sealed package and told people that they should only be opened if he died. That picture wasn't meant for the public to see. Not yet. Maybe never. The release caused a reaction that no one expected. Instead of being scared, they were interested. There was no fear. Instead, there was a strange interest. Even the ones that were taken down showed that there was something strange in those mountains. And there are people who are ready to risk everything to see something amazing. In 193, the problem got worse. A huge number of groups of interested people started to show up. There were too many people for the small town of Seymour to handle. Most of them were not ready for. The harsh truth about the Ozarks. Even though it had been open for a long time, Josiah Thorne's tavern was always full of people looking for directions to places they couldn't find, and the forest fought back against the invaders. The disappearances got worse. There were more than 2 groups each season. There were now dozens. People went missing during the day on well-marked paths, sometimes just meters away from other people. They were there one second and gone the next, leaving nothing behind. There were only short tracks that stopped in the middle of the path. In September 1913, the governor of Missouri finally did something about it. It said that people could not go into an area of about 100 square kilometers in the Middle Ozarks. He had troops from the state guard block the main trails and walk the edges of the forest to keep more stupid people from going into the middle of it. But forests don't care about human lines, and whatever they were, they didn't understand or care about what the government said. Attacks began to spread into the deep. Some farms on the edges of mountains said their cattle had gone missing. Overnight, families woke up to hear beats on their walls. Kids woke up yelling that someone was outside the window. They said it was someone too tall, with branches sticking out where their arms should be. It was October when a farm was found completely empty. The family quickly left, leaving food on the table, clothes in the cabinets, and tools all over the barn. written on the walls of the house with what looked like. Those symbols, which covered everything from floor to ceiling and looked like blood or sap, turned the inside of the house into a horror museum. Sarah Whitmore, who was 35 years old at the time and had 2 young children, started to see things. He saw the faces of his dead friends in the trees that lined the walls, in the clouds in the sky, and in the shadows that the candlelight made. When she was by herself, she heard their names being called. She knew for sure that the forest had not forgotten about her. That it just had to wait for the right time because it still wanted her. In November, she made a terrible choice. He got some people together, including Thomas Bridger and Sheriff Hackett, and told them he had an idea that they all thought was crazy. They were going to do what should have been done decades ago in the middle of the woods, where bones were hollow. They were going to wreck the place. They were going to burn down every tree, break every marked stone, and get rid of all signs of life. It might break that power, just maybe, place. It might free the souls that are stuck there. Another possibility is that it would only enrage something very old and scary that had been in those mountains long before humans did, and would stay there long after the last person left. 12 people offered to go on the trip. Everyone thought it was likely that they wouldn't come back. They wrote letters to their families, took care of their business, and made peace with whatever god they believed in. Then, on a cold December morning when the first snow fell, they set out. In the mountains, winter was starting to set in. Trails and tracks were being covered over, and the forest became a silent white maze. Sarah led the group as they thought about things that happened almost 10 years ago. She had tried very hard to forget those memories, but they were still painfully clear in her mind. It was awfully easy to recognize every tree, every path bend, and every valley. It was like going back to a bad dream that I had never really woke up from. Everything was taken. Kerosene, knives, torches, and more. They would have to carry out their plan to destroy. They also brought rifles and bullets, even though everyone knew that those tools probably wouldn't help them fight what they were going to face. But they brought some comfort and a sense of power to a situation that no one could change. The first signs that they were being watched came on the second day of their trip. The paths should have had snow on them, but they were too clear. The tree carvings looked like they had a light glow to them even during the day, having an inner light that wasn't from the sun pulse through it. There were sounds, but they weren't the drums yet. Instead, there were whispers carried by the wind that said things that were almost understandable and almost revealed secrets that no one in their right mind should know. When they were camping at night, they could see movement in the darkness that the firelight couldn't reach. They could see shapes moving between the trees and circles making and breaking up. They kept their distance and watched all the time. No one really slept. They did nothing but close their eyes and wait for morning. Come out in the sun to stay safe for a while longer. They got to the valley on the third day. Sarah knew what it was right away, even though it all seemed both familiar and strange at the same time. There were still dead trees, but now there were more of them. It looked like death was slowly spreading through the forest and eating the live trees around it. There were more stones in the circle in the middle, or maybe I just remember it being bigger. And the bones. There were a lot more bones than the last time she was there. The first time. As the group walked silently down into the valley, each step seemed to seal their fate. It didn't snow there. It looked like nothing had grown there in hundreds of years because the ground was dry, hard, and broken. Sarah could still smell that sweet smell of death in the air. Now, though, it was stronger, almost solid, and stuck to her throat like something thick. Thomas Bridger started to spread the kerosene by dumping it on the dead trees and soaking the stones in the circle. Dangerous paths that linked everything. The others got the torches ready and piled up dry twigs. They did everything they could to make sure the fire spread quickly and burned everything down. That's when the drums started. Not slowly like before, but all at once, loud, coming from everywhere at once. He felt the ground shake under him. Some of the stones in the circle moved around because they were shaking so hard. Then the figures showed up. This time there weren't dozens. There were hundreds coming out. From the trees around the valley, rising from the ground as if they had always been there, appearing from the stinky, thick air. All those forms that can't be made. Those bodies made of twisted plants and solidified fears are all coming together to form a circle. Sarah yelled for the torches to be lit. Sheriff Hackett lit the match first, which made it sizzle against the box and moved the flame closer to the torch that was wet with oil. It was bright and warm, and it felt so real when the light came on. Others came after. Following his lead, they made a circle of fire that briefly scared away the creatures. Then they threw the torches into the dead trees, the fuel-soaked ground, and even the stones in the circle. The fire started with such a roar that it seemed to have its own will. It climbed the trees in seconds and spread through the valley like a wave of cleansing. The animals ran away. It looks like they weren't safe from fire. When the flames hit the vegetables, they burned, cracked, and fell apart into ashes that were. The wind blew it. Some tried to move forward anyway, but were eaten before they could reach the group of people. Others just stood there and watched as they were destroyed. It was a terrible silence that was worse than any aggressive response. Then something came out of the middle of the circle of stones. Something that made all other living things look small and unimportant. It was that thing in the picture, that huge shape made of tangled roots and branches that could now be seen in all their hideous glory. It was at least 5 meters tall, maybe 6 meters. Its body was moving and changing shapes all the time, like it couldn't decide which horrible shape to settle into. A voice came from the dark hole where his head should have been. It wasn't a voice that you could hear. The voice went straight through the brain and made the bones shake. It hurt my teeth and made my blood boil. He talked in every language at the same time and in a tongue that no one could understand. That being said, everyone knew what it meant. He said, they were stupid. There was nothing important that fire could destroy. They were told that this place was only a manifestation and a link between worlds. What really existed there was beyond the reach of deadly fires, human understanding, and the limits of time and space as they knew them. Burning that valley was like cutting off a single leaf from a tree whose roots went all the way across the continent. Sarah Whitmore stepped forward, shaking but determined. He yelled back that even if it was just one point of contact, it was one less. Every burned symbol, broken stone, and downed tree was a small win over the horrible thing that had killed so many people. They were willing to fight even though they knew they couldn't win, because that was what made them different from things like her. The huge creature turned its unnaturally large body towards Sarah. For a moment, it looked like it was going to swallow her up, make her a part of itself, herself. But then he thought about it. It's possible that even that very old thing didn't fully understand what made people so determined. It might have been strong to face the impossible and refuse to give up. The fire kept getting bigger. As soon as the flames hit the giant creature's base, it did something that could have been seen as pain for the first time. From inside her came a deep moan that shook the air and hurt her lungs. It started to pull back and sink back into. It went back into the ground where it came from, taking hundreds of smaller animals with it that broke down into the ground like water soaks into dry sand. The drums stopped beating. The quiet that followed was different from all the other silences. There was no fear or oppression. It was completely empty. It looked like something that had lived there for an unimaginable amount of time had finally left, or at least gone deeper into the earth so it couldn't easily reach the top. The group did nothing while they watched the valley burn. The fires burned down. It was so hot for hours that it turned dead trees into coal, cracked rocks, and turned old bones into white ash that danced in the air like ghostly snow. There was almost nothing left when the fire finally went out at dusk. Broken rocks steamed, and there was nothing but empty space that looked better than it had in hundreds of years. 12 of the people who went into the valley came back. That was the first time in decades that a whole group had come back from those depths. They got burned, they were tired and scared, but they were still living, and they carried the hope that maybe, just maybe, they had made it easier for other travelers to make it across the Ozarks. After that day, Sarah Whitmore lived for another 24 years. The nightmares never went away fully, but they got less frequent and less bad. He could still hear the drums sometimes, but they were farther away and not as loud as before. They sounded more like memories than like a danger. She died peacefully in her bed, with her children around her. Grandkids, after going through a life that many people thought was impossible. Thomas Bridger never put out the rest of the pictures. He kept them until he died in 1928. As he asked, they were buried with him at his funeral. He chose not to tell everyone about some secrets because they were too heavy to carry. The bone hole never got better. Though it's been decades since the events of 1894, that part of the Ozark Mountains is still strangely empty. There are trees all around, but not inside the lines, where the valley used to be. It's like the earth won't grow life because it's still stained by something that can't be erased. Tourists still get lost in those woods every once in a while. Some have been found, lost but still living. Some people vanish without a trace. People still lock their doors and windows on calm fall nights when the wind blows through the deep valleys, because they know that some things are too old to die. Just go to sleep and wait for the next one. From time to time, the drums will lure visitors into the green darkness between the trees. We've been on this dark trip together through one of the scariest cases that the mountains of America have ever seen. If this story moved you or even just a little bit made your heart race, please consider subscribing to our channel. There are a lot of other secrets waiting to be found in the past. There are so many secrets that need to be found. If this show made you think about what? There is something scary living in these old woods. Tell me in the comments if you think there are places in the world where reality changes.